Yeah, thank you. Almost, Martina. Okay, good, we're live. Great. Yeah, thank you. Mute. There. Cool. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. It has been a full week of amazing presentations, lectures, and I personally feel like I'm learning so much every time, and I hope that everybody else is too. Today we are extremely lucky to have Valery Dymshits. I will apologize for all my pronunciation right now, who will be sharing with us some perspectives about the Jewish ethnomusicology, the collecting happening in Russia, in the USSR, in the early 20th century. And Valery is extremely qualified to talk about this. I think maybe he'll tell us a little bit about his background when we start. But he's been a researcher in the Petersburg Judaica Center and the European University in Petersburg. He's a professor. He's been doing field recording expeditions, many things. So he knows what he's talking about, and he's somebody who a lot of my friends who come from the former Soviet Union, in the St. Petersburg Klezfest and all these things, they're like, wow, this guy is amazing. And I think in America, somehow unfortunately, we don't get to hear his voice enough. So I'm very, very happy to present him here today. And I think with that, I'll let you take it away, Valery, and we'll go from there. And remember, everybody, we do have a question and answer period at the end. So please think of some good questions, and we'll ask them later. All right. Over to you, Valery.
So, may I start?
Yes, please.
Yes, good afternoon. First of all, I'm very thankful to the organizers of Weimar Summer program for their kind invitation. And let me introduce myself. It's Craig told you absolutely true. My working place is in the department Center Petersburg Judaica in European University. It's in Petersburg. European University is a graduate school for humanities in Petersburg, well-known graduate school, and we are very happy that we have for last 15 years the home for our center is in European University. It means my colleagues and me also, we are working mainly with the history and culture of East European and Soviet Jewry. What about my field of interest? It's Jewish ethnography, Jewish folklore, mainly folk tales, not the folk music, Jewish art, both folk art and professional art, and Jewish literature. And also I'm a translator. I'm translating from Yiddish into Russian. And I'm involved in Jewish studies for last, 30 years, maybe something like that. Today we will speak about the Jewish history of the Jewish ethnomusicology in Russia and early Soviet Union. Early Soviet Union, it means in pre-war period. As I understood, you received the full picture of the evolution of the Jewish ethnomusicology studies in Russia and in the Soviet Union from the wonderful lecture of my colleague Mila Sholokhova. And today I'll try to describe some sort of theoretical background for understanding how it happened that in first half of the 20th century Russia and Soviet Russia became the cradle for the ethnomusicology, Jewish ethnomusicology. When we are speaking about the complicated and serious things, it's hard to say that is one concrete reason which will explain us the whole story. There are many reasons which and quite serious evolution that brought us to such brilliant results, such brilliant collections of the folk songs and in general folk music, which were collected in Russia. So the first and the simplest reason is quite understandable. Russia had the largest Jewish population. Russian Empire had the largest Jewish population in the world. Or in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, it means that the total Jewish population in Russian Empire was close to 6 million, and about 2.5 million Jews left Russia in the end of the 19th, early 20th century. So we may say that that Russian Empire was the birthplace for more than 8 million Jewish people. It means much more than a half of the Jewish population of the whole world. But you see, it's some gap between the Jewish population, Jewish folk, Jewish masses with their folklore and the special school for folklore studies in general and ethnomusicology and ethnomusicology as a part of such school of folkloristic. Yes. And we will start with a very strange and meanwhile shameful fact that Jewish folkloristic and Jewish ethnographic and folk studies started very, very late. Of course, you remember that interest in folk culture started in Europe 100 years before, in the end of 18th, early 19th century, as a result of the two magnificent cultural movements, what we call Romanticism and nationalism. Yes, Jews were quite far from both. In the period of flourishing of Romanticism, there was no Jewish secular culture at all, especially in Eastern Europe. And what about Jewish nationalism, Jewish identity in the traditional Jewish society was, of course, not national, but religious identity. And only in the end of the 19th century, we can see some trends to the Jewish national search, to some interest to non-religious secular Jewish culture. It's a shame. Or better say maybe, it's a very strange fact that in the end of the 19th century, there were no serious scientific publication, and popular as well, dedicated to the Jewish folk culture. It's very, very strange. Yes, in the first half of the 19th century, and of course in the middle of the 19th century, almost all European nations collected and published their the heritage of their folk culture. Yes. Starting from England, France, Germany, and then to non-state nations. But what about the Jews? Jewish nationalism was a very, very strange nationalism. Yes, because every national movement in Europe was based on the idea of the foundation of the national state. Yes. People were collecting folklore, folk music, folk culture as a base for the constructing a new political nation based on ethnic culture. Yes, but Jewish nationalism was quite far from idea that there is some sort of a usable past in diaspora, in better say, in Golos, yes, in Golos, because the first trends of a Jewish nationalism were connected with, first of all, Palestinophilic movement, then Zionism, political Zionism. So folklore was a symbol of different folk superstitions, and I prefer here Yiddish word, Narishkeiten, Zababonas, for the people who were connected with the Jewish Enlightenment, a scholar, or a shameful story of the Golos diaspora for the Zionists. Only in the beginning of the 20th century we see the new Jewish intelligentsia, which believed in possibility to build Jewish culture in Europe, based not on the national state, because there was no space for the national space in Europe. Yes, we are speaking about the dispersed minority, very huge minority, but dispersed. But based on such a new political philosophy as or socialist movement or autonomous movement, mainly connected with such names as political philosopher and historian and research in the field of Jewish history, Shimon Dubno. So there was no space, no place for the Jewish folk studies till the beginning of the 20th century. The first serious collection of the Jewish folklore, musical Jewish folklore, was published in 1901 in Petersburg. Later we will return to this edition. And it's quite symbolic because you know that almost all folk studies in Europe started from the collecting and publishing of the folk songs, because the founder of folklorism, the founder of the folklore studies, Herder, proclaimed that the best part of any folklore tradition is the best part of any folk tradition is folk song. Yes, the soul of the folk is inside the folk songs. Yes, almost all folk songs, German, English, Scottish, Scandinavian, Russian, Polish, and so on, were published in the period of Romanticism in the early 19th century, and you see the first such collection, typical for the beginning of any folklore studies, was published. We are speaking about the Jewish folklore only in the beginning of the 20th century. Yes. Of course, the interest of the Jewish folk culture in general and Jewish musical folklore came too late, and of course it means that Jewish scholars, people who were responsible for the collecting of the Jewish folk culture, were in a hurry. They understood that they came too late. They had no time. And because of that, the Jewish folklore studies looked like some sort of a cultural revolution, or even more, a cultural explosion. The second reason we will discuss more concrete, more serious, was the specific cultural climate in Russian Empire in the end of the 19th century, and especially in capital of Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. Yes, and we will start with a very interesting, absolutely non-Jewish figure, the person who did a lot for Jewish culture in Russia, and it means in the whole world. And we will, what happened with my presentation? I'll try, yes. Vladimir Vasilyevich Stasov, art and musical critic, ideologist of Russian national art, both in the field of the fine art, architecture, music, literature, and so on, and so on, and so on. Vladimir Stasov was a very influential writer, critic, ideologist, and a very strange figure. He was what we may call liberal nationalist. He believed that each folk had to have its own national culture based on the typical characteristical features of the national folk culture, and the culture of Russian Empire in general would be some sort of a symphony, like an orchestra, where each nation will play its own musical part. Of course, his first interest was in Russian art, Russian music, Russian architecture, and so on and so on. Yes, we know that he was the founder, the ideologist, not the founder, but the ideologist. Sorry, the ideologist. So 1 second. I will stop my. Okay, he was the ideologist of two very, very important Russian national artistic movements. He was the ideologist of the Russian artist school, so-called передвижники, people, artists who tried to depict the everyday life of the Russian peasantry, Russian village, and he was the founder, one of ideological founders of the famous Russian composers group, so-called Могучая Кучка, or the Five. Among them, such well-known composers as Borodin, Balakirev, Mussorgsky, and Rimsky-Korsakov. Yes, the idea of music proclaimed by Stasov was quite simple. His artistic program was quite simple. Professional composers have to collect folk music and then produce their professional music, symphonies, operas, ballets, and so on and so on, based on the tradition of the national musical folklore. The second best beloved child of Stasov, it's interesting, was Jewish culture. He was very much involved as an ideologist in Jewish folk culture, early studies of the Jewish folk culture, for example, even in 70s of 19th century. He published very important article dedicated to the exhibition of the Jewish folk art, better say religious art, religious objects on the World Exhibition in Paris, and explained that Jewish artists have to study their own folklore traditions. It was absolutely theoretical idea. There was no real samples of such studies in the period we're speaking about, and do the same work which did Russian art and other East European nations. Stasov was very much involved, for example, in publishing Jewish folk ornaments from the medieval manuscripts, which are stored in Imperial Public Library, now Russian National Library. He was the member, even the chairman of the committee of the building Petersburg synagogue, and tried to make this design based on historical ornaments and historical samples of Jewish architecture, and so on and so on and so on. He was the patron of the famous Russian Jewish sculptor Mark Antokolsky, and so on and so on and so on. So we may say that the second reason for the flourishing of the Jewish ethnomusicology in Russia was the climate, cultural climate in Russian Empire, in Russian Empire in general, in the end of the 19th century. Returning to Могучая Кучка, I have mentioned that, of course, the key role in Jewish ethnomusicology played another quite famous person, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Yes, the famous composer, one of the members of this team, Могучая Кучка, and he was the professor, very prominent professor of the Petersburg Conservatory. And returning to the history of the Jewish musicology in Russian Empire, now we will mention the key role of the Society of the Jewish Folk Music. The Society of Jewish Folk Music was founded in Petersburg in 1908, the same year when Rimsky-Korsakov died. The core team of this society, all of them were graduated from the Petersburg Conservatory, and they were students, they were scholars of Rimsky-Korsakov. It's a very interesting situation. We were speaking about, now we will speak about the Society of the Jewish Folk Music. The Society of the Jewish Folk Music had the same program as Могучая Кучка about 45 years before, collecting Jewish folk music, different folk music, and then producing professional music based on Jewish folklore. They had both practical and theoretical tasks. Practical, collecting as much Jewish melodies, tunes, records as possible, and the theoretical task was to understand what is the characteristic features of the Jewish folk music, Jewish musical folklore, what is specific for the Jews, and based on these characteristic specific features, start to produce new professional Jewish music. Look, what is important? There is a straight road from Staf through Rimsky-Korsakov to the Society of the Jewish Folk Music. Students of Rimsky-Korsakov organized the same society based on the same principles as Могучая Кучка, which was founded in the 60s of the 19th century. It is well known from the memoirs that Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov told to his students, your folk, Jews, to his Jewish students, of course, your folk has such a rich folk music tradition. Why you ignore your own musical heritage? Yes, you have to with the Jewish musical heritage, folk heritage, the same thing which we, it means we, Musorsky, I, Balakirev, and so on, Borodin did before. We discussed the principal reasons. Let us go to some occasionals. You know that in Russian, first in Russian gymnasiums and later in Russian universities, was special anti-Jewish discrimination. Jews were discriminated because there was numerus clausus, процентная норма, yes, for the Jewish students in universities. By chance, Petersburg Conservatory was absolutely unique university. There was no numerus clausus, no процентная норма in Petersburg Conservatory. Why? Because from the from official point of view, Petersburg Conservatory was not a state university. It was a private school, because Petersburg Conservatory, it was from the day of its foundation. Meanwhile, the founder of Petersburg Conservatory also was a Jewish person, Russian composer. He converted, of course, in his childhood. Russian composer Anton Rubinstein. Petersburg Conservatory, from official point of view, was organized. It was managed by the Emperor Russian Philharmonic Society, a non-state organization. So Petersburg Conservatory was a non-state university, and it never had numerous clauses, never had процентная норма. So it means that there were a lot of Jewish students in Petersburg Conservatory, and the core team, the organizers of the Society of the Jewish Folk Music, were the scholars of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who himself was quite far from any xenophobia and any anti-Semitic ideas. He was a real liberal person. He was very, very fond of his Jewish students and did a lot for them. Meanwhile, speaking serious, more or less the same happened with the other national composers' schools in Russian Empire. We know that among the students of Rimsky-Korsakov were a lot of people from different ethnic groups lived in Russian Empire. And so we may say that the students of Rimsky-Korsakov became more or less in the same period, early 20th century, the founders of the national musical schools in Georgia, in Armenia, in Latvia, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we may put Jewish musical renaissance in the line of more or less same movements which happened in Russian Empire, in Petersburg Conservatory, under the what happened with the support of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, let us discuss the pioneers of studying Jewish musical folklore in Russian Empire. As I mentioned, the first edition was published in Petersburg. You can see the title of this famous book «Еврейские народные песни в России», собранные и изданы Саулом Гинзбургом и Песахом Мариком. Издание редакции «Восхода», Jewish folk songs in Russia, collected and published by Shaul Ginsburg and Pesach Marek, a publishing house Восход, Sandown, a famous magazine and publishing house, which was the pioneer and the most serious publishing house in Jewish publishing house in Russian Empire. It was also located in Petersburg. Meanwhile, you see, there was a strong connection between the Jewish culture in Petersburg in general, by chance, and music, because all important Jewish addresses in Petersburg were Jewish private gymnasium, publishing house Восход, of course, great choral synagogue, were in the same neighborhood, in the same district as the famous Mariinsky Theater and Conservatory. So both Jewish heart of Petersburg and musical heart of Petersburg are located more or less in the same neighborhood. Yes, it's a funny story. Anyway, Pesach Marek, who was a journalist, educator, and historian, and Shaul Ginsburg, who was a journalist, publisher of the first Yiddish everyday newspaper in Russia, in the whole world, in Russian Empire, Der Freund. He founded Der Freund in 1904 in Petersburg. Historian, author of a very, very, very interesting memoir book, Amerika Petersburg, the former Petersburg, started in 1900 collecting folk songs very, very late. They started with the idea which later became very much popular, especially with the help of the Jewish Historical and Ethnographical Society and Semyon Akimuchansky. They asked so-called zamlers, collectors, sent them the text of the different folk songs, and they published folk songs in their famous collection. The second pioneer of Jewish ethnomusicology in Russia was Yuli Engel. Or in his Jewish name, Yoel Engel, who was also he also graduated from Petersburg Conservatory. He was a well-known composer, but much more famous as a musical critic and musical journalist. He wrote a lot for Russian newspapers, of course, not about the Jewish music, but music in general. He wrote a lot for different Russian encyclopedias about the history of the world music, different composers, different musical schools, and so on and so on and so on. Later in 20s, he left Soviet Union, and after several years in Berlin, came to Palestine and became one of the founders of a musical life in Palestine, means in Israel in general. Yes. In the same year, 1901, Engel organized in Moscow with the help of Marek several concerts where he tried to show for the educated public his first samples of the collecting of the Jewish musical folklore. So we can see that the beginning of some steps, some roots of the Society of the Jewish Folk Music started even earlier than the society was founded. Now let us return to the society itself. As I mentioned, it was founded in 1908. And it's interesting. Why 1908? Why this year was so important in the cultural life of the Jewish community, Jewish society in Russian Empire? What happened? The answer is absolutely clear. The previous year, 1907, was the year when quite unsuccessfully finished the first Russian revolution. It is a strong connection between the unsuccessful end of the first Russian Revolution and cultural renaissance, Jewish in general, and special Jewish cultural renaissance in Russian Empire. After years and years of a very, very conservative and stable life, something happened in Russia. Dozens, thousands, and 100,000 of young people who were involved in the public politics. And majority of the people who later were active in Russian culture, in Jewish culture, what we call the silver age of the Russian culture, started as the members of a revolutionary movement. In 1907, after the serious political crisis, all revolutionary activities were stopped. There was nothing to do in political life, and the energy of the young people went in the new canal, cultural life. Yes, we may say that the period between the end of the First Russian Revolution, 1907, and beginning of the First World War, 1914, was the most flourishing period in Russian culture and Jewish culture as well. Yes. In 1908, returning to our Jewish subjects, was founded not only Society of the Jewish Folk Music, but another very important society also in Petersburg, Society of Petersburgian Jewish Historical and Ethnographical Society, which quite soon became responsible for folklore expeditions. Folklore expeditions. Let us speak about the general figures in this society, which was very, very active between 1908 and more or less 1917, October Revolution, but formally was active till 1924. It was the union of a dozen and dozen composers and musicians and folklorists. It published a lot of music, a lot of collection, both of folk music and professional Jewish music. It did a lot for making Jewish music popular. It organized concerts, public lectures, and so on and so on and so on. The first chairman of the society was composer David Chernomortikov, who, meanwhile, he is a very good sample of such connection between the political and cultural processes. David Chernomortikov was member of Russian Social Democratic Party, Bolshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Party, and one of the most active Bolsheviks during the First Russian Revolution. Also, he was a professional musician. He received music education in Paris. He was student of famous French composer Charles Gounod, for example. And meanwhile, because of his political activity, his left political position, Jewish Society of the Jewish Folk Music survived in 20s. Survived in 20s. It's interesting that the people who started their professional career in Society of Jewish Folk Music later became very important musicians and music activists in different countries. Some of them stayed in Soviet Russia. Some of them left Russia after the revolution, and after several years in Europe, migrated or in Palestine, or in states, or through Palestine to states. For example, Shlomo Razovsky, another founder of the society, became one of the most important figures in Palestinian musical life in 20s, 30s, and 40s, and finished his life and career in states. Lazar Saminsky was a very important figure in American musical life, and Mikhail Gnesin, maybe the most famous member of Jewish folk Society of Jewish Folk Music, was the famous member of a famous musical family. Yes, was the professor of Moscow famous Gnesin School, and one of the most prominent both composers, musical critics, and teachers in Russian musical life. In Russian musical life, yes. Among other members of the society, we can mention such names as Crane, Milner, Pulver, Veprik, Achron, and many, many others. All of them were people who collected Jewish folk music and made their professional Jewish compositions based on the folk music tradition. It's interesting that majority of the people who, when we are trying to see on their biographs, their life stories, we can see the same feature. Not all of them, but majority of them were born quite far from traditional Jewish area, quite far from the areas where Jewish folklore, including musical folklore, was alive till the beginning of 20th century. For example, Engel was born in Berdyansk, southeastern Ukraine, very far from the traditional Jewish regions such as Podolye or Volhynia or Western Belarusia. For example, Chernomordikov was born in Baku in Azerbaijan, we may Transcaucasian region, and so on and so on and so on. So all of them were involved in the Jewish musical movement, and better say Jewish cultural movement, national movement. But for them, Jewish melodies, Jewish folk music was not something which they heard from their childhood. It was something which was for them an exotic thing. And it's interesting, it's important that I believe for collecting folk culture, studying folk culture, usage of folk culture, you need to have some distance between your personal biography, your personal background, and real folklore. Another important page in the story of collecting and studying and usage of Jewish folk music were folklore expeditions organized by Semyon Akimchansky, Shlomo Zandvil Rapoport, professional revolutionary. He was one of the founders and member of Central Committee of SR Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, such a very important and very dangerous, meanwhile, terroristic organization. Ansky was a bilingual writer. He wrote both in Yiddish and in Russian a lot. Editor, publisher, journalist, activist, and he proclaimed after his returning from emigration in 1906 that his aim is collecting Yiddish folklore and Jewish ethnographical materials. What for? The reason was absolutely political. For founding Jewish folk in the special meaning of this word, folk, narod, which was in usage of Russian populists, narodniki, yes? Very specific political construction. Anyway, Ansky brought new activity in the life of the Petersburgian Historical Ethnographical Society, because since the foundation of the society, since the opening of the society, since 1908, it was mainly a historical society, and he in reality made this society both historical and ethnographic, yes? His expeditions, 3 expedition seasons, 3 expedition groups, 1912, 1913, the more successful expedition, and 1914 expedition was stopped 1st August of 1914 because of the starting of the First World War, became the starting point of Jewish ethnography and folkloristic, and Ansky was proclaimed the father of Jewish ethnography and folkloristic, and it became itself the part of the folklore. Yes, we say that there were legendary expeditions. His first expedition in 1912, the expedition group was only 3 people: Ansky himself, his nephew Shloime Yudovin, or Solomon Yudovin, later prominent Soviet artist, and in expedition he was the photographer, and Engel. And Engel, who collected Jewish folk music. It's interesting that Ansky, who was absolutely utopist, believed that the most prominent figures in Russian Jewish intelligentsia will join his expeditions. He invited famous artist Leonid Pasternak in his expedition. He invited genius Hebrew and Yiddish poet and writer, national Jewish poet Chaim Nachman Bialik in his expedition. Nobody joined him because majority of them were quite far from the idea that Jewish folklore, shtetl folklore is something interesting, something important. Among serious figures, only Engel joined Ansky, and only for one season. Only for one season. The next 2 seasons, 1913-1914, his group, which became much larger, consisted mainly from the people who were not so well known as Engel, for example. What about ethnomusicology? One of the members of the second expedition group, 1913, was well-known ethnomusicologist Zinovy Kiselgov. And his figure is very interesting because it is a real illustration of the connection of the three different trends, which are 3 roots of the Jewish folklore and ethnomusicological studies. Musical education. Kiselgov graduated from Petersburg Conservatory. Teaching, yes, because collecting of the folklore was a very practical thing for the Russian Jewish intelligentsia. They proclaimed that it would be the base for the new educational program in the new secular Jewish schools education. And Kiselgov was famous, first of all, as a teacher. He was teaching music in the private Jewish gymnasium, Eisenberg Gymnasium in Petersburg, before the revolution, before he took part in the expeditions. And later, after the revolution, he became the founder and the director for 20 years of the Jewish orphanage and school, Jewish school in Petersburg, later in Petrograd and in Leningrad. Yes, famous Yiddish school on Vasilievsky Island, where he was both a director and the teacher of music. So you see, his pedagogical career was very strong connected with his career of ethnomusicologist. And the first starting point, the third root of ethnomusicology is connection with the revolutionary movement. Kiselgov also was member of Social Democratic Party, of its Jewish wing. He was Bundist, he was member of Bund, and even he was arrested during First Russian Revolution. So we can see 3 things: musical education based on Petersburgian Conservatory, left political activity, and activity as an educator. All 3 things we can see in his biography. It's interesting that the strong interest to the Jewish folk music and it was the most successful part of the Jewish folk studies in pre-revolution, the most successful part of the Jewish folk studies. One second, one thing I forgot. Of course, Mila told you, but it's also the influence of a personal interest, personal features, or you can Ansky influence on the methods of collecting of folklore. Yes, Ansky was the fanatic of new gadgets. And because of that, he was one of the pioneers of usage of recording technique. You can see the phonograph on the photo, and photographing. His expedition made 1,500 photos in different places of the Pale of Settlement in the different shtetls. Jewish folklore studies in general in Russia were from the very beginning focused on musical studies, ethnomusicology. And of course, this is the reason, this is the explanation why among all other pages of Jewish folkloristic, all other parts of the Jewish folkloristic, ethnomusicology was the most successful in the Soviet Union. Yes, it's interesting. We believe that between the pre-revolution epoch, pre-revolution time, and Soviet period, there is a huge gap. Of course it is. But meanwhile, in some traditions, some ideas, some initiatives started in pre-revolution period flourished after the revolution. And because of that, when we'll try to see everything which was done in Soviet Union in the field of the Jewish culture, Jewish folk culture, the most successful were the musical studies prolonged, and you see prolonged by Moishe Beregovsky and his younger colleague Zalman Skuditsky in Kiev in the Institute of Jewish proletarian culture. It's interesting that, for example, other centers of Jewish folklore studies, for example, famous Yiva in Vilna, concentrated on some other things, for example, language or folk narration or folk art or something different things. But what about the Soviet Union? It was in principle, it was proclaimed that the Soviet Union is very pro-Jewish and supported Jewish studies in the Jewish folk culture. But in reality, the main support was focused on the ethnomusicological studies, and of course, it was the trace, the influence of a pre-revolution period. Here you can see Beregovsky and his opus magnum, Purimspiel, or officially Jewish folk musical and theater performances, and folklore leader published by Skuditsky. So I'll try to focus myself on the theoretical background, theoretical roots, explaining us why Jewish ethnomusicology was so successful in the late years of the Russian Empire and first years of the Soviet Union. And of course, it is the result not only richness of the Jewish musical folk tradition in Russian Empire, because, as I mentioned, there is a distance between the folk reality and academic activity, but the result of a very specific cultural situation in Russian Empire in pre-revolution years. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for your question. And if you have question, I'll try to add something to my lecture. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Valery. It's a lot of information and history. Some things I think I knew a little bit about, some things not so much, but it's really helpful, I think, to have it all together. If anybody in the Zoom has questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, or just write that you want to ask a question and I will unmute you. I have a few questions. Maybe I'll start with some of these. Somebody else has something? I'll jump in and then we see. Let's see. You talked a bit about why this study of Jewish folklore started in the 20th century and not before. But I'm curious, like before this, what do you think was like the opinion about Jewish folk culture? Like, was it seen as not its own culture, not distinct? Like, I know like Yiddish, like some people say Yiddish is a jargon, it's not a language, and
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And for the music also, like, do you think for klezmer musicians, you know, in 1850,
yes.
Did they think like this is Jewish music and this is...
Absolutely. You see, I was a little bit afraid that I have not enough time, but let us return to the years before the First World War. One of the most important things in the Jewish musical life in Petersburg was the public discussion on the pages of the Russian Jewish press. Of course, it was in Russian, between Engel and Saminsky, two very important figures I mentioned. Yes. What is Jewish music? Engel believed in a very, I think, contemporary, modern things. He proclaimed that Jewish music is the music which we can find in the everyday usage of the Jewish people. What people are singing, playing, used on during the festivals, via holidays, via weddings, and so on and so on and so on. Saminsky had much more conservative point of view, and he proclaimed that because Jews are living in diaspora and under the strong cultural oppression, and especially in the last years when Jews became more open for the whole world, we can see the traces of Ukrainian, Belarusian, Moldavian, folklore in Jewish folk music, and influence of European theater music, opera, and so on, blah, 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 in Chazanut, for example, Chazonas. And because of that, our duty as members of the Jewish Musical Society, as serious composers, serious researchers, is to pick the real Jewish tunes, the authentic Jewish melodies inside this garbage, more or less the same idea. Our contemporary folk music is some sort of jargon, and there is a real serious fundamental biblical roots of the Jewish music, and we try to find it among different influences, different folk melodies, which are both Jewish and non-Jewish, and so on and so on and so on. So more or less the same discussions, the same problematic which we see in general cultural discussions. Yes, the battles between people who were pro-Hebrew and pro-Yiddish, for example. Yes, we see in the specific sphere of musical life. So absolutely the same.
Uh-huh. And actually, that's the one perfect little advertisement for tomorrow. Michael Steinlauf will talk about this conversation about Yiddish or Hebrew and how this new Yiddish culture was being born. So everybody, please come back. I'm curious also, like not just in the Jewish world, but well, like often now when people like me, we see this music, you know, we get so attracted to the very folk, very raw village style thing, and we try to understand this itself. But my understanding is often it feels like they wanted to collect it in order to elevate it and make it into art music. I know you're not like a musical historian, but a general ethnographer. But was there a value on the folk music itself, and was it prevalent, or in like Russian society in this time, it was a really big distinction between high culture, low culture?
Both. You see, they collected folk music. They played folk music on concert stage. And meanwhile, it is the first step. It was the first step to the contemporary situation, because you know, everybody knows, of course, that, for example, klezmer music, yes, it is not a concert music. It is a music for the wedding party, yes. So people who collected klezmer melodies had put it or in original version or in elaborated version, doesn't matter, on the concert stage, made the first step to the contemporary situation in the Jewish music life and in world music in general, yes? So they collected, they published, they rewrote, elaborated the folk melodies and used it inside their professional symphonies, operas, and so on and so on and so on. And you see, it also was what is important when we are speaking about the society of for this society of Jewish folk music, общество еврейской народной музыки. What is important? They did more or less the same, which was proclaimed for all artistic fields. In the same years, a little bit later, but also in pre-war years and during the First World War, people from the Jewish artistic avant-garde, especially people in Kiev, young artists in Kiev, Kulturliga, yes, they started folk art. For example, in 1916, two famous, great, prominent artists, Lazer Lisitsky, later El Lisitsky, and Suherber Rybak, organized the expedition in Belarus, special expedition for collecting and studying of wall paintings in the old synagogues. Why? Because they believed, both composers and artists, that folk art in general, melodies, pictures, and so on and so on, could be the real fundament, the real base for the new national style, new national idea. What was the conflict, the discussion between the previous generation and young people in the early 20th century? The previous generation, composers or artists, doesn't matter, believed that mechanical copying of some Jewish subjects or making portraits, when we're speaking about the art, the portraits of the Jewish types on the streets, yes, in a realistic way, it's enough to making the new Jewish art the national Jewish art. People from avant-garde, both musical avant-garde and artistic avant-garde, believed that there is a special Jewish style, a special Jewish tunes, special Jewish melodies, special Jewish compositions or colors or something like that. And if we'll try to find this quintessence, this core Jewish style inside the Jewish folk tradition, we will receive possibility to do our free art dedicated to everything. Yes. But it would be Jewish because we will use the special melodies, Jewish or style or colors or something like that. Yes, that's it. They were not only looking for extensive way of collecting musical material, but we were looking for special. They believed that there is something specific in Jewish melodies which make it Jewish.
Interesting. Oh, good. Yes, please.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I hope you can understand me.
The mask, it's a problem a little bit.
Yeah. I have a question. These broad activities by Russian ethnomusicologists, were they being recognized internationally at that time? Or was it more in a
little bit later? You see,
Yeah.
after the revolution, the important part of the team emigrated in Palestine, in Europe, in States. And because of that, they brought their beliefs, their ideas, their musical collections, their experience in different countries. And so we may say that after the revolution, because of the immigration, it became a very important part of the international musical life, especially Jewish musical life.
Okay, thank you.
I have another one. You were saying how when these early ethnographers, they had the feeling a little bit like they came too late almost to document this culture. I'm curious what you think they thought or what you think, like, was this culture in 1900, 1908 more or less in its state that it had been for a long time, or was already very different than 1880s or 1850s? And
you see, it's a great question. It's a question good enough for the next lecture, for the next 2 hours.
Right.
Speaking serious, this medal has two sides. From one point of view, we may say that the belief that the real traditional culture, Jewish, non-Jewish, doesn't matter, traditional culture, is something stable and conservative. It's an absolutely ideological construct. Folk culture changed as any culture from year to year, from century to century. It's a normal thing. Yes. Another thing is that what are the reasons for collecting folk culture now? And it depends very much on ideological fundament of a concrete collector. In 1908, the same year, Ansky, before his first expedition, 4 years before his first expedition, published in Russian, of course, very important ideological article, we may say some sort of a manifest, under the title "Еврейское народное творчество," Jewish folk creativity. And he proclaimed that our folk culture is in crisis. Everything in our folk melodies, folk music, folk tales, songs, and so on, everything is in ruins. Everything was destroyed in the last years. The melodies which I heard in my youth does not exist now, and so on and so on and so on. So it means we Jewish intelligentsia we have the last chance to save the life traces of the live folk tradition. Even more, we may say that according Ansky, Jewish folklore, any folklore, Jewish folklore as well, is something which is in a dangerous situation, close to disappearing. Yes, if something is flourishing, we don't believe that it's a real folklore. Folklore for Ansky and for his scholars is something which is in a dangerous situation. It's close to disappearing. Last traces of a real conservative old tradition open for us. We are just in the last minute. There is 2 minutes before the midnight. That's it. 2 years later, the very important folklorist from Warsaw, but he was also born in Russian Pale and studied in Petersburg University. Noach Prilutsky, who lived in Warsaw, published his collection, very important collection of Jewish folk songs, 1910, and wrote a very brief preface to his collection with absolutely different intention. And of course, it was some sort of polemic with Ansky. Prilutsky wrote that. You see, I am a busy person. I have many things to do in Warsaw, but I have a vacation for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And for 2 weeks, during 2 weeks, I had free time for visiting several shtetls around Warsaw and collected folk songs for such a thick volume. So, Jewish folk culture is something which is flourishing, which is living according to its own laws. It's full of old traditions and innovations and everything. And our problem is that we, Jewish intelligentsia, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish activists, our duty is not to save it. According to Ansky, it was the operation of saving last traces. But we are standing with a small cup on the shore of the ocean and try to pick something from the ocean with our small, very, very, very tiny vessel. Absolutely different vision, yes. And you see, it's not about the inner life of a folklore tradition. It's about the methods of collecting, the principles of collecting, the result of collecting it as published collections. That's it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions that we could talk another 10 hours about probably. We are sort of out of time. I don't know, should we just wrap up or do you have time for 1 or 2 more questions? What do you think, Valery?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so maybe...
Thank you for the invitation, it was my pleasure.
Yes, it's our big pleasure too. I hope we can do this again sometime in the start of many studying sessions. Cool. So thank you, everybody. Please join us tomorrow with Michael Steinlauf. Please do whatever you can to learn more from Valery here. And there's quite a few good books about some of this stuff, so I hope that we will all just keep doing this research and learning more about ourselves. So I guess see everybody later. Hopefully enjoy the concert or enjoy dinner or breakfast, depending where you are. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Спасибо большое. Окей, пока.
Счастливо. До свидания.
Yeah, до свидания. Good Shabbos.